The night Daniel Cross promised to marry a woman he did not love. The rain fell so hard it felt intentional, as though the sky itself were trying to wash the world clean. Before something unforgivable was spoken into it, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and endings. Machines hummed softly in the dim room, their rhythm steady and indifferent, counting down a life that had already begun to loosen its grip. Eleanor Hale lay in the bed by the window, her once lively hands now thin and pale against the sheets, her breathing shallow, her eyes still sharp in a way that unsettled everyone who stood near her. She was dying, and she knew it. Everyone did. Cancer had hollowed her body quickly, mercilessly, leaving behind only time enough for unfinished sentences and desperate requests. Daniel stood beside her, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched so tightly it ached, feeling like a boy pretending to be a man at the edge of a decision he did not yet understand. They had grown up together, Daniel and Eleanor, two stubborn children, racing bicycles down cracked sidewalks, sharing secrets they never told anyone else, swearing loyalty with pinky promises that felt eternal when they were young. Eleanor had always been braver than him, louder in her convictions, quicker to stand between injustice and silence, even when life began to punish her for that bravery, when a house fire scarred her face and arms, when poverty forced her to abandon dreams of college, when illness arrived uninvited and unrelenting. She never learned how to be small. Daniel, on the other hand, had learned early how to survive by choosing comfort, by stepping sideways instead of forward, by letting others be heroes while he remained safe. And now here he was, safe no longer, trapped by memory and love and a promise that had not yet been spoken, but was already pressing against his chest like a weight. Eleanor smiled when she saw him watching her, that familiar crooked smile that made him feel 12 again. She asked him if he remembered the day they swore they'd never abandon each other. And before he could answer, she told him she did. She told him she remembered everything. She spoke slowly, each word carefully chosen, and said she was afraid not of dying, but of leaving behind a woman who had never been chosen. Her sister, Mara, poor, scarred from the same fire that had marked Eleanor, quieter but no less resilient, a woman the world passed over without seeing. Eleanor said she didn't trust the world to be kind to Mara, and she didn't trust Mara to fight it alone. Then she looked straight at Daniel, eyes burning with urgency, and asked him to promise something he knew would ruin him. She asked him to marry her sister. The words landed in the room like a dropped plate, sharp and final. Daniel laughed at first, a reflex born of panic, but Eleanor did not smile. She reached for his hand with surprising strength and told him she was serious. She said Mara would never ask for help, never demand love, never insist on being chosen. And that was exactly why she needed someone who would choose her anyway. Someone stable, someone decent, someone who owed Eleanor his life in more ways than he cared to admit. Daniel tried to protest, tried to explain that promises made at deathbeds were unfair and cruel, but Eleanor cut him off. She said love was not always a thunderbolt. Sometimes it was a decision made in fear and kept in courage. She said Daniel had always been good at surviving, but now it was time for him to be brave. When he finally nodded, when the promise left, his mouth in a whisper he barely recognized as his own, Eleanor closed her eyes in relief. She died before sunrise, taking with her the girl who had always believed Daniel could be more than he was. And Daniel left the hospital just as the rain stopped, carrying a promise that felt heavier than grief, heavier than guilt, heavier than anything he had ever known. Mara Hale stood alone at the funeral, dressed in a black coat that had once belonged to Eleanor, its sleeves too long, its shoulders too big, as though even in death her sister was still trying to protect her. The scars along Mara's jaw and neck were visible in the daylight, pale and uneven reminders of a fire she rarely spoke about. People avoided her eyes, spoke to her only when necessary, their sympathy thin and awkward. Daniel watched her from across the cemetery, heart pounding, knowing something she did not, carrying a secret that felt like a betrayal already in motion. He had not yet decided when he would tell her, or if he ever would. All he knew was that the promise still burned in him, unfulfilled and demanding. Mara did not cry the way people expected. Her grief was quiet, controlled, locked behind clenched fists and a stiff spine. When the service ended and people began to drift away, she remained by the grave, fingers brushing the cold stone as though memorizing its shape. Daniel approached her then, unsure what role he was meant to play in her life now. She thanked him for coming, her voice steady, her eyes hollow, and said Eleanor had spoken of him often, always with pride. The words felt like a knife. Daniel nodded, said the right things, offered help he did not know how to give. Mara declined gently, as she always did, saying she would manage. She always managed. That was her curse. Weeks passed. Daniel returned to his life, his apartment, his job, his carefully constructed routines, but Eleanor's voice followed him everywhere. He found excuses to check on Mara, bringing groceries she hadn't asked for, fixing things that weren't broken, lingering too long in doorways. Mara accepted his help with quiet gratitude, but never expectation. She worked long hours at a textile factory, came home exhausted, cooked simple meals, and spent evenings reading worn library books under dim light. She did not complain. She did not hope. She lived as though survival itself were the only promise worth keeping. Daniel began to see the world through her endurance. He noticed how people spoke over her, how they dismissed her intelligence, how they flinched unconsciously at her scars. He noticed how she noticed these things too, and how she refused to let them define her. There was a strength in her that made his promise feel less like charity and more like a challenge. Still, fear gnawed at him. He was not in love with her. He was not even sure he was capable of loving someone who did not fit neatly into the life he had imagined. And yet, every time he considered walking away, Eleanor's last look returned to him, filled with trust that bordered on command. The night he finally told Mara about the promise. It was raining again. She listened without interruption as he explained, his voice shaking, his words clumsy and inadequate. When he finished, silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Mara stared at the floor, her hands trembling, and for a moment Daniel thought she might break. Instead, she laughed softly, a sound so unexpected it startled him. She said she would never accept a marriage born of pity, never live as a favor. Someone regretted. She said Eleanor had always believed too much in other people. Then she thanked Daniel for his honesty and asked him to leave. Daniel walked home feeling smaller than he ever had, realizing too late that bravery was not a promise made in a hospital room, but 1,000 decisions made when no one was watching. Days later, Daniel returned, not with apologies, but with truth. He told Mara he was afraid of failing her, afraid of himself, afraid of becoming the kind of man who hid behind good intentions. He told her he did not love her, not yet, but he respected her, admired her, and wanted to learn how to choose her without obligation. Mara listened, eyes sharp, and said respect was a better foundation than romance built on lies. She said she would not promise him love either. She would promise honesty, survival, effort, and if that was not enough, they would walk away without resentment. They married quietly 3 months later, in a courthouse with peeling paint and flickering lights, no flowers, no audience, just two people standing on uncertain ground, bound not by passion, but by resolve. Daniel felt no triumph, only a strange calm, as though he had finally stepped onto a path he could not abandon. Mara did not smile in photographs, but her eyes held something new, cautious possibility. Neither of them knew then how much this promise would cost, or how deeply courage would be carved into them before love ever arrived. Marriage did not soften the world for Daniel and Mara. It sharpened it. Living together exposed the quiet fractures neither of them had been ready to name. Mornings passed with polite exchanges and carefully avoided glances. Nights settled heavy between them, filled with the unspoken awareness of two lives intersecting without fully merging. Daniel tried to be kind in visible ways. He cooked dinners, paid bills without complaint, offered warmth through gestures that felt rehearsed. Mara accepted these acts without illusion. She had survived too long on too little to mistake provision for devotion. What unsettled her was not Daniel's distance, but his effort to hide it, as though discomfort were something shameful instead of honest. Daniel, meanwhile, was learning how exhausting avoidance could be. He had thought bravery would arrive the moment he signed the marriage certificate, But instead it waited for him in smaller, crueler forms. It waited in the way Mara flinched when he raised his voice without meaning to. It waited in the silence that followed when co-workers asked about his wife, and he described her vaguely, as though specificity might expose his uncertainty. Worst of all, it waited in the mirror, where he began to recognize the same man who had stood beside Eleanor's hospital bed, well-intentioned, terrified, and dangerously close to choosing comfort over truth again. The turning point came on an ordinary evening. Mara returned home later than usual, her clothes smelling of oil and fabric dust, her hands raw from overtime she had not mentioned. Daniel noticed the tremor in her shoulders, the fatigue she could no longer hide, and something in him broke open. He asked her why she never asked for help. She answered simply that help was never guaranteed, but disappointment always was. The words struck deeper than accusation. They were history, they were survival, and they were a challenge Daniel could not ignore. That night, for the first time, Daniel told her about his failures, not just the promise, but the pattern, the opportunities he had walked away from, the conflicts he had avoided, the times he had let braver people stand alone. Mara listened without judgment. When he finished, she said something that stayed with him long after the room fell quiet. Courage, she said, was not loud. It was persistent. It showed up even when no one was watching, even when fear insisted it was safer not to. Daniel realized then that Mara had been courageous long before he ever entered her life, and that if he was to be worthy of her, he would have to change without being asked. Change did not come easily or cleanly. Daniel began by standing beside Mara in ways that mattered. He confronted co-workers who spoke about her with casual cruelty. He learned to listen without fixing, to offer presence instead of solutions. He stopped apologizing for the marriage and started claiming it not as a sacrifice, but as a choice he renewed daily. Still, love remained elusive, hovering just beyond reach. Fragile and unspoken, Mara noticed the difference before she trusted it. She had learned that improvement could be temporary, that kindness sometimes expired. Yet Daniel's effort did not fade. He accompanied her to medical appointments she had long neglected. He encouraged her to take night classes she had once dreamed of but never believed possible. When fear crept in, whispering that she was still invisible, still unchosen, Daniel answered it with consistency. With time, the scars that had once defined Mara began to lose their power, not because they disappeared, but because they were no longer the most remarkable thing about her. Daniel saw her humor, dry and unexpected. He saw her intelligence, sharp and curious. He saw her kindness, not naive but deliberate. And slowly, without ceremony, affection grew, not the cinematic kind, but something sturdier, something earned. The moment Daniel realized he loved her did not come with fireworks. It arrived quietly, on a night when Mara fell asleep on the couch, a book slipping from her fingers. He covered her with a blanket and felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, not fear, but reverence. He understood then that love was not the absence of doubt, but the decision to stay despite it. He whispered the truth into the empty room, practicing it until it no longer terrified him. When Daniel finally told Mara he loved her, she did not respond immediately. She studied him, searching for cracks, for conditions, for the fine print life had taught her to expect. Then she asked him why. He answered honestly, not with compliments, but with gratitude. He told her she had taught him how to be brave when no one demanded it, how to choose integrity over ease, how to love without guarantees. Mara cried then, quietly, for the girl she had been, for the woman she had become, for the sister who had believed in a future she herself had never dared to imagine. She told Daniel she loved him too, not because of the promise, but because he had honored it. By growing beyond it, their love did not erase the past, but it transformed it, turning obligation into intention, survival into partnership. Years later, when asked how they had met, Daniel would smile and say they were brought together by a promise. Mara would correct him gently. They were kept together, she would say, by courage, and somewhere, in whatever comes after life. Eleanor Hale would finally rest knowing she had been right about them both. Love, once found, did not spare Daniel and Mara from pain. It invited a deeper kind of it, The years that followed their quiet confession were not gentle ones. The world did not suddenly reward Mara for her resilience, nor did it forgive Daniel for the years he had spent hiding from himself. What changed was not circumstance, but posture. They stood differently now together, but not fused, each carrying their own weight while refusing to let the other collapse beneath it. Mara's health began to falter first, quietly, the way everything dangerous does: a lingering cough, exhaustion that sleep could not mend. Daniel noticed before she admitted it, watching the way she paused halfway up the stairs, the way she dismissed symptoms with practiced indifference. Fear returned to him like an old enemy. He recognized its voice immediately, the same one that had whispered to him in hospital corridors years before. But this time, he did not obey it. He insisted. He pushed. He stayed. The diagnosis was not cancer, not dramatic enough for faith's symmetry, but serious enough to threaten everything they had built. A chronic condition that would demand care, compromise, and patience without end. Mara listened calmly as the doctor spoke, nodding, asking precise questions. Daniel watched her and understood something devastating. She had always been prepared to endure. He had not. The courage he had learned from her was about to be tested in ways Eleanor's promise had never required. That night, Mara apologized to him, to the universe, to the silence itself. She said she never wanted to be a burden. The words struck Daniel harder than any diagnosis. He told her, fiercely, that love did not keep score, that staying was not charity, that he was not fulfilling a promise anymore. He was choosing her. Again and again, without witness or reward. For the first time, Mara believed him completely. Courage, Daniel learned, was exhausting. It was waking up early and going to bed late. It was advocating when Mara was too tired to speak. It was learning medical language, insurance language, patience. It was losing promotions because he refused to abandon her during relapses. It was listening to well-meaning voices tell him he was a good man, and resisting the urge to scream that goodness was not the goal presence was. Mara, in turn, learned how to receive without shame. It was harder than enduring pain. It required vulnerability she had spent a lifetime avoiding. She learned to ask, to lean, to let herself be seen not as strong, but as human. And in that shared weakness, something extraordinary formed between them, an intimacy forged not in passion, but in trust. They argued. They failed each other. Daniel snapped under pressure more than once, retreating briefly into silence before forcing himself back into the open. Mara feared abandonment even when none was coming. But unlike before, they named these fears. They faced them together. Love became not a feeling they waited for, but a discipline they practiced. Years passed, quietly, intentionally. Mara completed her education, one class at a time, until she no longer introduced herself as someone who had survived a fire, but as someone who had built a life. Daniel changed careers, choosing work that aligned with the man he had become rather than the one he had once pretended to be. They did not become extraordinary by the world's standards. They became something rarer. Honest. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, Daniel and Mara returned to the cemetery together. The headstone had weathered, softened by time and rain. Mara placed her hand against it, eyes closed, breathing steady. Daniel stood beside her, no longer haunted by that night, no longer crushed by the promise. He understood now that Eleanor had not asked him to save her sister. She had asked him to become someone worthy of standing beside her. Daniel spoke aloud then, not in apology, but in gratitude. He thanked Eleanor for her faith, even when it had felt like a burden. He told her he had learned what bravery actually was, not the moment of promise, but the lifetime that followed. Mara listened, tears slipping silently down her face, and, for the first time since her sister's death, she felt peace instead of ache. They left the cemetery hand in hand, not because they needed each other to stand, but because they wanted to walk forward together. The promise that had once begun in fear had ended in something far more enduring than romance. It had ended in transformation. And if anyone ever asked whether Daniel had kept his promise, the answer was simple. He had married her. He had stayed. And when it mattered most, he had finally been brave. Time did what it always did. It moved forward without asking permission. Daniel and Mara aged into their lives the way trees grow around old scars, not erasing them, but making them part of the structure. Their home filled with small, unremarkable sounds that somehow became sacred. Kettles boiling, pages turning, Mara's steady breathing in the early hours of morning when pain woke her before the sun. Love no longer announced itself loudly between them. It existed in systems, in routines, in the unspoken understanding that neither of them was going anywhere. Mara's condition stabilized but never disappeared. Good months came, then bad ones, each teaching Daniel something new about restraint. He learned that fixing was not the same as helping, that optimism, when forced, could feel like abandonment, so he learned to sit with her discomfort instead of rushing past it, to let silence be enough. In those moments, Mara saw the final proof of his transformation, not the man who promised under pressure, but the man who stayed when no one was watching, when no promise demanded it. They never had children. It wasn't a tragedy, just a truth shaped by health and choice. Still, their lives were not empty. They mentored quietly neighbors, kids, co-workers, anyone who hovered at the edge of being overlooked. Mara had a way of seeing people before they learned to see themselves. Daniel noticed how often those people returned years later, steadier, stronger, carrying gratitude they struggled to articulate. He realized then that legacy did not always require blood. Sometimes it required attention. One winter evening, after a particularly difficult stretch, Mara asked Daniel if he ever regretted it, the promise, the marriage, the life that followed. The question was calm, not loaded, but it caught him off guard. He thought carefully before answering, because the old version of himself would have tried to soften the truth. He told her no, not because everything had been easy, but because regret belonged to the man he had been before her, the man who mistook safety for peace. He told her she had given him a life that demanded his full presence, and that nothing meaningful had ever come without cost. Mara smiled then, tired but content, and said she had once believed bravery meant enduring pain without complaint. She said loving him had taught her something different, that bravery could also mean letting yourself be held, even when you feared the hands might let go. They sat together as snow gathered quietly against the windows. The world hushed, as though honoring a truth spoken at last. Years later, when Mara's health declined again, more sharply this time, Daniel did not panic. Grief was there, yes, but it no longer paralyzed him. He was not the man standing helpless in a hospital room anymore. He knew how to stay. He knew how to choose. And when the inevitable conversations came, difficult and gentle all at once, they faced them with the same honesty that had built everything else. Mara died on a calm morning, sunlight spilling softly across the room. Daniel held her hand, steady, present, whispering nothing urgent, nothing unfinished. There were no promises left to make. Everything that mattered had already been lived. When she was gone, the silence hurt, but it did not hollow him out. Grief came in waves, but so did gratitude. He had not loved her briefly or conveniently. He had loved her fully, persistently, bravely. At her memorial, people spoke not of her suffering, but of her steadiness, her quiet insistence on dignity, her ability to make others feel seen. Daniel listened, recognizing the echoes of the woman he had known, the woman who had changed him without ever demanding he change. When it was his turn to speak, he said only this: that courage was contagious, and that Mara had given it freely to anyone willing to learn. Later, alone, Daniel visited Eleanor's grave one last time. He told her the story, not in detail, not dramatically, but with peace. He told her the promise had been kept in ways neither of them could have imagined, that love had arrived not as a reward, but as a consequence of becoming better than he had been. Daniel went on living, quietly, intentionally, and if anyone ever mistook his gentleness for weakness, he smiled, knowing how hard it had been earned, because bravery, he had learned, was not how a story began. It was how it was lived every day, long after the promise was made. After Mara's death, Daniel learned a different kind of solitude, not the sharp loneliness he had once feared, but a quiet companion that walked beside him without cruelty. The house remained full of her books lined neatly on shelves, her notes tucked into drawers, the faint scent of tea leaves lingering long after the kettle had gone cold. Daniel did not rush to erase these traces. He understood now that absence did not require forgetting. Love had changed shape, not disappeared. He continued the routines they had built together. Morning walks, weekly volunteer shifts at the community center where Mara had once taught literacy classes, small conversations with strangers who needed listening more than advice. People often assumed grief would break him, but Daniel knew better. He had been broken before by fear, by avoidance, by the man he had once refused to confront. This grief was different. It was heavy, yes, but it was clean. It did not hollow him out. It reminded him that he had lived fully enough to miss someone deeply. On the anniversary of Mara's passing, Daniel opened a box he had never been able to touch before. Inside were letters written by Mara over the years, addressed to no one. In particular, reflections on courage, on scars, on choosing to stay even when leaving would have been easier. She had never meant them to be read as a legacy, but Daniel understood immediately that they were one. He spent the evening reading until his eyes ached, realizing that Mara had been teaching long after her body had begun to fail. Daniel shared those words carefully, not publicly at first, just with people who reminded him of who Mara had once been: overlooked, underestimated, quietly resilient. The letters spread slowly, intentionally, passed from hand to hand rather than posted for applause. And something unexpected happened. People began to respond. Letters came back, stories, confessions, accounts of promises kept too late or courage found too slowly. Daniel listened. He always listened. He never positioned himself as the hero of the story. He told anyone who asked that he had simply loved someone who knew how to be brave. Before he ever did, in truth, the promise that had once terrified him had grown into something larger than marriage or obligation. It had become an inheritance of courage, one that did not belong to him alone. Years later, a young woman approached him at the community center, scars visible beneath her sleeves, voice steady but eyes afraid. She told him Mara's words had helped her leave an abusive home, that someone finally saw her not because she was strong, but because she deserved to be. Daniel felt the familiar ache in his chest, not of grief this time, but of awe. He realized then that love, when lived honestly, did not end. It multiplied. In his later years, Daniel wrote once more, not a memoir, not a confession, but a letter, addressed simply to whoever needs this. He wrote about a promise made in fear and kept in courage, about a woman who never believed she would be chosen and a man who learned, too late and just in time, how to choose her fully. He wrote about bravery as a daily practice, not a single moment of heroism. When Daniel died, quietly and without spectacle, the letter was found among his things. It was read at a small gathering of people whose lives he had touched directly and indirectly. Some had known him well, others had only known his words. All of them recognized the truth inside them. The story of Daniel, Mara, and Eleanor was never meant to be legendary. It did not reshape the world. It reshaped people. And sometimes that was enough, because a promise, when honored beyond obligation, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a life. It becomes a legacy. It becomes courage passed on, unbroken.